In the tumultuous world of organized crime, few figures loomed as large in the public imagination as John Gotti, the flashy Dapper Don, who dominated headlines in the 1980s. But behind the notorious Gambino family boss stood a woman whose quiet strength and steadfast loyalty often go overlooked. His wife, Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti. She spent 40 years by Gotti's side, raising their children and weathering the storms of his criminal life. As she once put it, "I have spent 39 years of my life with him." Is John a saint? Oh, no. I don't think so. But I love him. Her story, one of love, loss, and resilience, deserves to be told on its own terms, not just as a footnote to her infamous husband's legend. Born on December 5, 1942 in Brooklyn, New York, Victoria DiGiorgio grew up straddling two cultures. Her mother was of Russian Jewish heritage and her father Italian, a heritage Victoria embraced even as her parents' marriage unraveled early in her childhood. Raised primarily by her mother after her parents split, young Victoria learned independence at an early age. By her mid-teens, she was described as a striking girl with dark eyes and a cautious heart, a Brooklyn regatta with an ingrained sense of family duty and traditional values. Yet, like many young women of her time and neighborhood, she also longed for stability and love beyond the modest means of her upbringing. Victoria's first brush with adult life came sooner than expected. Still in her teens, she entered a relationship, perhaps even a brief marriage, according to later FBI records, and gave birth to a daughter while barely 16 years old. It was an experience that could have easily cast her into scandal or hardship in the late 1950s. A half-Italian, half-Russian girl, a child out of wedlock, or from a youthful marriage gone sour and a future suddenly clouded with responsibility. Yet those who knew her recall that Victoria possessed a resilient spirit beneath her gentle exterior. She was determined to provide a good life for her baby girl, even if it meant defying societal expectations. Little did she know that a chance encounter at a local bar would soon alter the trajectory of both their lives. In 1958, Brooklyn was a place where destinies intertwined over corner table conversations and jukebox tunes. It was in such a setting, a neighborhood bar in Brooklyn, that 16-year-old Victoria first met an ambitious 18-year-old with a sharp smile and an even sharper suit, John Gotti. Their introduction was anything but glamorous. He was just another local youth with an eye for pretty girls. And she was a young single mother wary of smooth-talking boys. Gotti, born in the Bronx in 1940, but raised in Brooklyn's tough streets, was already dipping into petty crime by then, running with local gangs and learning the ropes of the mob underworld. But on that evening, he was simply Johnny from the neighborhood, trying to get the attention of the beautiful Victoria. At first glance, they made an unlikely pair. John was the son of an impoverished Italian-American family with 13 children, scrabbling to get by in the tenements of East New York. He had grown up resentful of his own father's inability to provide, and was determined never to be poor again. Victoria, by contrast, had known a stable home until her parents split, and despite her own early detour into motherhood, she carried herself with a quiet, almost conservative poise. She was not dazzled by bad boys or easy charm. In fact, friends would later recall her initial skepticism of Gotti's intentions, and yet something sparked between them in that Brooklyn bar, a chemistry neither could deny. John was drawn to Victoria's demure beauty and the maturity born of her circumstances, while Victoria sensed beneath John's bravado a fierce drive to rise above his hard-scrabble beginnings. They talked for hours that first night. If Victoria mentioned her infant daughter, John didn't balk. In fact, his willingness to accept her situation may have been the first sign that this brash young man had a protective side. Within a short time, the two became inseparable. He was 18, she was just 16, an article would later note simply. But those numbers belied the depth of their bond. For John Gotti, who had spent his adolescence on the streets, Victoria represented a sense of home he had scarcely known, a woman who could anchor him. For Victoria, John offered excitement and a promise, sincere or not, that he would take care of her and her child. After a 4-year courtship, Victoria DiGiorgio and John Gotti married on March 6, 1962. She was 19 and he, 21, both so young that they needed their parents' consent to wed. The ceremony was a modest affair in a New York church, far removed from the lavish weddings the Gotti name would later be associated with. In their wedding photos, Victoria's shy smile is paired with John's proud, almost defiant grin. A portrait of a couple ready to face the world together. Come what may, the newlyweds moved into a small apartment in Queens, not far from John's childhood neighborhood. Money was tight in those early years. Determined to support his growing family, John made a brief attempt at going straight, taking jobs as a presser in a coat factory and as a truck driver's assistant in 1962. For a short while, it seemed as if the young couple might lead a simple, honest life. Victoria became a full-time homemaker, stretching each paycheck to cover groceries and rent and doting on her baby daughter, whom John had embraced as his own. Before long, they welcomed their first child together, a daughter named Angel, followed by another daughter, Victoria, named after her mother. In 1962, John Jr. arrived in 1964, the first son and a namesake to carry on the Gotti legacy, and two more sons, Frank in 1967 and Peter in 1974, completed the bustling household in the years that followed. By the mid-1960s, Victoria was a mother of 5, counting her eldest from before marriage and barely into her 20s. But the straight and narrow path was not one John Gotti could walk for long. Honest work brought honest pay, and it wasn't enough for the dreams John harbored. He wanted more for his family than a life of scraping by as his parents had. The siren call of the streets with their quick money and quicker violence drew him back in. By 1966, John had been jailed twice for petty crimes, and Victoria had to confront the reality that her husband was deeply involved in the mob life. The late 1960s saw John running truck hijacking operations at Idlewild Airport, soon to be JFK Airport, with his crew. Inevitably, the law caught up. In 1968, John and several associates were arrested for hijacking cargoes of goods. Not yet a made man, but already a valued associate of the Gambino crime family. Gotti took the fall and in 1969 was handed a prison sentence that would keep him behind bars until 1972. For Victoria, those years were an early baptism by fire into the role of a mobster's wife. She suddenly found herself alone with 4 young children. She was pregnant with their 5th little Peter when John went to prison. I pretty much raised my children alone with Johnny being gone for years at a time, she later reflected in an interview. It was a burden she had never expected when she vowed for better or worse. While other young mothers in the neighborhood might worry about daycare or their husbands getting overtime pay, Victoria was fleeing her kids on buses and subways to visit their father in prison. The visits were a bittersweet ritual. John, clad in prison garb, would sweep up the little ones in his arms, promising them toys and better days, while Victoria tried to put on a brave face across the visiting room table. After each visit, she carried the children home alone, answering their innocent questions of when's daddy coming home as cheerfully as possible, then returning to a house that felt achingly empty without John's boisterous presence. Money was a constant source of tension. The modest income John had managed to provide from odd jobs and low-level rackets disappeared with him behind bars. Money was a constant source of tension. The modest income John had managed to provide from odd jobs and low-level rackets disappeared with him behind bars. The Gambino family sometimes provided scant financial support to the wives of incarcerated associates, but it was hardly enough. Proud and private, Victoria disliked asking for help. She clipped coupons, mended hand-me-down clothes, and did her best to shield the children from the wolf at the door. When John was released in 1972, coming home to his family just before Christmas, Victoria felt a cautious hope that maybe this would be the end of their troubles, that John's prison stint had scared him straight. For a brief period, the Gotti household knew a semblance of normalcy. Family dinners, John roughhousing with the boys on the living room floor, and Victoria finally sleeping with a sense of safety beside her husband again. That hope proved short-lived. In 1973, John was drawn into even darker waters. The mob world had turned violent with internal disputes, and John, ever eager to prove himself, became involved in the revenge killing of a gangster who had kidnapped a Gambino captain. The hit succeeded, but John was identified and arrested for attempted murder in 1974. Just 2 years after regaining her husband, Victoria was again left to endure his absence as he went to prison on a manslaughter conviction. This second incarceration from 1975 until 1977 was, if anything, even harder on her than the first. Now the children were older and more aware. Angel and Victoria Jr. were in their teens. John Jr. approaching adolescence. They had begun to grasp that their father's business was not like other dads. While the Gotti name was still not front-page news in their Queens neighborhood, it was no secret that John had ties to organized crime. The children faced whispers at school. Victoria faced them in the grocery store line. Stoic and fiercely protective, she maintained a facade of normalcy. When curious neighbors asked about John, she'd reply simply, "He's away working." With a tight smile. Privately, she nursed a growing resentment toward the mob life that kept stealing her husband away. John Gotti's release from prison in 1977 marked a turning point. No longer a low-level hood, he emerged with his reputation in the Gambino family enhanced. He had, after all, served his time and kept his mouth shut that he was promptly made as a full member of the family and soon entrusted to lead his own crew. With higher standing came greater earnings. The late 1970s brought the Gotti family a prosperity they had never known before. John began bringing home larger wads of cash, illicit earnings from gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets. And Victoria, after years of scraping by, suddenly found she could shop for nicer clothes and decorate their home more lavishly. By the early 1980s, the Gottis moved into a spacious house in Howard Beach, Queens, a comfortable middle-class enclave far removed from the mean streets of East New York where John grew up. It had a swimming pool in the yard and a Cadillac in the driveway. Outwardly, it seemed the family had achieved the American dream. And yet, comfort came at a price. John's rising star in the underworld meant he was often away from home, if not in prison, then at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, his crew's hangout and unofficial headquarters of his burgeoning empire. He kept long nights conducting business over cards and scotch with his gang or attending meetings with higher-ups. When he did come home, arguments with Victoria were frequent. They quarreled over the hours he kept, the company he kept, and the perpetual risk shadowing their family. When John was home, the two fought about money and his dealings with the mafia. One account recalls, Victoria worried about the example being set for their children, especially their sons, and she disliked how John spent extravagantly on flashy suits and nights out, while she tried to instill frugality and humility in the household. More than once, she pleaded with him to consider another way of life, or at least to be careful. But caution was not John Gotti's style. The tensions occasionally boiled over in dramatic fashion. In a show of pique at John's near-constant presence at the Bergen Club, Victoria once took the extraordinary step of packing up his entire wardrobe. All the custom-tailored buy-in suits, silk shirts, and monogrammed cufflinks that symbolized his double life and sending the clothes to the club with a turnout that if he was going to spend all his time there, he might as well dress there. 2.1 Can only imagine the look on the mobsters' faces as boxes of the Don's clothing were delivered to their hangout. The message from Mrs. Gotti was loud and clear. John was furious at first, but even he had to admit privately that his wife had a point. To outside observers, such a bold gesture showed Victoria's unique position in Gotti's world. She was perhaps the only person who could upgrade the mighty John Gotti and not face retribution. In the privacy of their home, she was not afraid to remind him that he had duties as a husband and father, not just as a capo on the rise. Despite the friction, there was genuine love between them, forged in those early years of struggle. John had a soft spot for Victoria's cooking. He often boasted about her pasta sauce to his crew, and he doted on the children whenever he could, bringing home expensive toys or tucking envelopes of cash under his wife's pillow to surprise her. His way of apologizing after a spat. For Victoria's part, she tried to look the other way when John's temper flared, or when whispers reached her ears of her husband socializing with women of less than sterling reputation at clubs. She later admitted that the betrayal she feared most were not the cliched mistress many mob wives tolerated, but something far more devastating to her. It broke my heart. I felt betrayed. The worst betrayal that I would rather have dealt with other women, she said, referring to a very different transgression of John's that would come years later. For now, though, Victoria managed the household with grace. Sundays were for family dinners, John at the head of the table, carving roast beef, teasing teenage Angel about boys, quizzing young John Jr. about his grades. Gotti, who had quit school himself, was adamant that his children get an education even as he led a life of crime. Victoria kept a strict traditional home. The children attended Catholic Mass. Chores were assigned and done. And the chaos of Jay's outside life was not to intrude on the sanctity of their household. By the early 1980s, John Gotti's underworld career was reaching a dangerous inflection point. His boss in the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, was at odds with John's mentor, Anello Neil DeCroce. When Delos died of cancer in 1985 and Castellano failed to show proper respect at the funeral, John seethed. Victoria, though she tried to stay uninvolved in mob politics, sensed the brewing storm. She noticed John's late-night meetings became more secretive, his demeanor more tense. That December, Castellano was assassinated in a brazen hit outside a Manhattan steakhouse. A move that catapulted John Gotti to the head of the Gambino family, even as he reportedly watched the murder from afar. Suddenly, the kid from the Bronx with an 8th-grade education was the most powerful mob boss in America. And the Gotti name was about to become infamous worldwide. Even as John Gotti reached the apex of his power in the underworld, the family was struck by a catastrophe that no amount of influence could prevent or undo. On March 18, 1980, the Gotti's 12-year-old son, Frank, a lively, sweet-natured boy who was the apple of his mother's eye, was killed in a horrific accident in their Howard Beach neighborhood. Frank had been riding a friend's minibike around the block when a neighbor, 51-year-old John Favara, came driving down the street. In a split second of tragedy, Favara's car struck the boy. Frank was dragged beneath the vehicle, suffering fatal injuries. The accident occurred just a few hundred feet from the Gotti home, and the screams soon drew Victoria and others running to the scene. What they found was every parent's nightmare. Frank's broken form and a chaotic scene of neighbors shouting in an ashen-faced Favara in shock. Frank was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. He died that same day. John Gotti later told his daughter Victoria, Frank's older sister, that telling his wife their boy was dead was the hardest thing he ever had to do. And that seeing Victoria sitting in the hospital waiting room made him afraid for the first time in my whole life. This from a man who had ordered murders and faced down armed rivals without flinching. In that moment, John's biggest fear was not a bullet or a prison cell. It was the sight of his wife's inconsolable grief. When Victoria saw John's face as he approached her in the hospital corridor, she knew instantly that Frank was gone. A wail tore from her that those present would never forget. She collapsed into John's arms, sobbing with an anguish that words cannot capture. Their baby. Because even at 12, Frankie was the baby of the family, the mischievous little boy with an impish grin, was never coming home again. In the days and weeks following Frank's death, Victoria descended into a despair deeper than anything she had ever known. The home that once echoed with Frankie's laughter was now painfully silent. She kept his room exactly as it was, the toys on the shelf, his jacket hung on the chair, as if preserving it might somehow bring him back. According to her daughter's memoir, Victoria fell into a profound depression, requiring heavy medication, and even attempted to take her own life on 2 occasions in her overwhelming grief. Her family found themselves in the uneasy position of watching over her around the clock. Angel and Victoria Jr., barely adults themselves, took turns sitting by their mother's bedside during her worst spells, afraid to leave her alone. John, dealing with his own sorrow, was also furious. Furious at fate, at God, and especially at the man who had been behind the wheel of the car. John Favara, the neighbor whose car struck Frank, insisted it was a terrible accident. By most accounts, Favara was not speeding wildly at the time of impact, but he did have poor vision in one eye and perhaps simply didn't see the boy dart into the road from behind a dumpster. There were rumors that Fava had been drinking, though this was never proven conclusively. The police found no cause to charge him with a crime. It truly seemed to be a tragic accident. But for Victoria, that was no comfort. In her eyes, whether through recklessness or negligence, John Favara had taken her son's life, and his behavior afterward only poured salt in her wounds. Favara allegedly did not immediately stop after the collision, perhaps not realizing what had happened. In the aftermath, he did not approach the Gotti family with an apology or condolences. This perceived callousness enraged Victoria beyond measure. About a week after Frank's funeral, emotions in the neighborhood were still raw. One evening, Victoria spotted John Favara in his front yard, directly across from the Gotti home. Overcome with rage, she grabbed one of Frank's aluminum baseball bats and marched out the door. Her eyes filled with hate, disbelief, and grief, she stormed onto Fava's property, swinging the bat in a blind fury. She smashed the bat against Fava's parked car, shattering the headlights and denting the hood. Neighbors came running as she then lunged at Fava himself, who recoiled in terror. Victoria's swings missed the man, perhaps intentionally, or perhaps her grief was too overpowering for aim. But the message was clear that "I'll kill you," she screamed at him before neighbors pulled her away. Favara declined to press charges, likely realizing that the grieving mother's outburst was an understandable burst of anguish. Still, the incident terrified him. Shortly after, threatening graffiti appeared on Fava's property. The word "murderer" scrolled in large letters. Recognizing that he might be in real danger given who Frank's father was, John Favara made plans to leave New York. That summer, as the Gotti family took a trip to Florida in an effort to help Victoria recover from the bleak surroundings of home, Favara prepared to move away for good. But he never got the chance. On July 28, 1980, just days before he was to depart, John Favara was abducted outside his workplace on Long Island. According to witnesses, several men forced him into a van. He was never seen again. Missing person posters went up and eventually Favara was declared legally dead, but no trace of his body has ever been found. The disappearance occurred while John Gotti was conveniently out of town, providing him an alibi. And for years, the fate of John Favara remained an unsolved mystery. It wasn't until 2001, when a mob informant divulged details to authorities that the world learned what likely happened. Favara had been killed on the orders of a vengeful John Gotti. According to the informant's account, Favara's body was dissolved in a barrel of acid, ensuring it would never be recovered. John was never charged in connection with the disappearance, with no body and no eyewitness testimony. There was no case. But by the early 2000s, as Gotti faced other charges, prosecutors publicly named him as responsible. When detectives once asked Victoria about Favara's fate, her response was chillingly matter-of-fact. "I don't know what happened to him, but I'm not sorry if something did," she said. "He never sent me a card. He never apologized. He never even got his car fixed." These words, delivered by a woman usually described as gentle and private, revealed the depth of her fury and pain. It was as if in her moral ledger, Favara's lack of remorse made him deserving of whatever vengeance might have found him. In the immediate aftermath of Frank's death and Favara's vanishing, the Gotti family closed ranks. Their trip to Florida was extended to give Victoria time away from the scene of the tragedy. Sunlight and palm trees could only do so much. She was deeply medicated. Her daughter Victoria Jr. later wrote of her mother during that time. The depression clung to her. Back in New York, John, who normally insisted on being the family's rock, at times found himself at a loss. He had money, power, and dozens of loyal men willing to do his bidding. But none of that could mend his wife's broken heart. In quiet moments, neighbors would see John and Victoria walking arm in arm down the street, neither speaking. The usually swaggering gangster reduced to a husband helplessly supporting his grieving wife. Frank's death marked the end of any innocence or hope for normalcy in the Gotti household. The 1980s pressed on, and with Castellano's assassination in 1985, John Gotti became boss of the Gambino crime. Almost overnight, the Gotti name went from underworld circles to the front page of every New York newspaper. John relished the attention. He strutted in front of TV cameras outside the courthouse, flashing that cocky smile and dressed to the nines, earning him the nickname Dapper Don for his expensive suits. Later, as he miraculously and as it turned out corruptly beat several federal indictments, he gained another nickname, the Teflon Don, because no charge seemed to stick to for Victoria. However, the glare of the media spotlight was unwelcome and frightening. She had married a neighborhood tough guy, and even as he rose through the mob, she operated in the shadows, raising her kids quietly. Now, suddenly, reporters camped outside their house. Photographers jostled to snap pictures of her if she stepped out to run errands. She withdrew even further from public view, determined to maintain her privacy and dignity. Unlike some mob wives who reveled in luxury and limelight, Victoria remained a model of discretion. On the rare occasions she appeared at Jay's side, such as at their son John Jr.'s lavish wedding in April 1990, she was impeccably dressed but reserved, offering a demure smile for the cameras and nothing more. If people expected the mafia boss's wife to be a gaudy, flashy figure draped in diamonds and furs, Victoria defied the stereotype. She did enjoy nice things. John made sure she had fur coats and jewelry, but she wore them privately, not for show. Yet, being the boss's wife meant enduring new levels of strain. The late 1980s brought relentless law enforcement pressure on John and by extension on the family. FBI agents tailed Gotti everywhere and even surveilled the house. It was not uncommon for Victoria to pull the curtains in her living room and spot unmarked sedans parked up the block. Agents with cameras watching who came and went. Wiretaps were placed in the Bergen Club and even in the apartment above the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy where John held meetings. Victoria could do nothing about these intrusions, but remained stoic inside the home. She refused to let the children speak about family business on the phone, cautioning them that the feds might be listening. Her life became one of careful routines, grocery shopping at the same trusted local stores. Lunch with a small circle of old friends who wouldn't sell stories to tabloids. Evenings spent mostly at home in front of the television while John was out conducting business. Sometimes weeks would pass with her seeing her husband only briefly in the early mornings when he returned from the club, reeking of smoke and exhaustion, sliding into bed for a few hours before disappearing again. Despite it all, she stood by him unfailingly in public. At the 1986 trial, where Gotti was accused of racketeering, one of the high-profile cases he would beat, helped by jury tampering, Victoria attended a few sessions, sitting quietly in the back, her expression a mask of composure. When Gotti was acquitted and crowds of rowdy supporters cheered outside the courthouse, Victoria slipped away, not joining in the public raillery. That wasn't her way. Her support was demonstrated in more intimate gestures. A squeeze of Jay's hand when the not guilty verdict was read, or a home-cooked feast awaiting him that night to celebrate. By the end of the 1980s, John Gotti was at the zenith of his power and perhaps hubris. The Gambino family under his leadership was reportedly grossing hundreds of millions a year, and he had become a fixture in New York's popular culture. There were Gotti t-shirts being sold on street corners and he was portrayed thinly veiled in TV movies. Victoria saw this and felt only dread. To her, the more attention John drew, the bigger target he became, both for law enforcement and possible rivals. John, however, waved off her concerns. He felt untouchable and no wife's nagging as he saw it would persuade him to lay low. The late 8S also brought another shift within the family. Their eldest son, John Gotti Jr. began to be drawn into the mafia life. Unbeknownst to Victoria at first, John Sr. had started involving John Jr. in low-level activities and grooming him as an eventual successor. This was done in secret, partly because John knew his wife's feelings on the matter. Victoria had always been adamant that her sons not follow in their father's footsteps. She wanted them to be legitimate law-abiding men, professionals, businessmen, anything but gangsters. John Sr. would half-heartedly agree, saying, of course, he wanted the same. But as the saying goes, blood doesn't water down easily. And the Gotti patriarch, proud of his empire, eventually could not resist bringing his namesake into the life. In 1990, John Gotti's world came crashing down. In December of that year, the FBI finally arrested him on a sweeping federal indictment armed with damning evidence, including secret recordings of Gotti discussing crimes, largely provided by his disillusioned underboss-turned-informant, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Grano. Gotti was charged with multiple murders, including ordering Castellano's hit, racketeering, and a laundry list of other crimes. This time there would be no beating the rap. As 1991 turned into 1992, John was stuck in a jail cell awaiting trial. And Grano's betrayal was splashed across the news. Victoria, despite having endured 2 prior imprisonments of her husband, found this one qualitatively different. Her husband wasn't just away. He was likely gone for good. The evidence was overwhelming, and with Gravano testifying, conviction was all but certain. She steeled herself for the outcome, but even she couldn't have predicted the next blow about to befall her. In January 1992, while John was still awaiting trial, FBI agents showed up at the Gotti home, not for John Sr., but for John Gotti Jr. At 27, John Jr. had quietly become acting boss of the Gambino family during his father's legal troubles, attempting to keep the business running. Victoria was blindsided by the revelation. She answered the door that day to find agents with an arrest warrant for her son on racketeering charges. It said that in that moment, something in her broke. All the years she had tolerated her husband's choices came crashing into one piercing realization. John had allowed their son to be pulled into the same deadly quagmire. When she managed to see her husband in prison not long after, Victoria was for perhaps the first time in their marriage truly furious with him. And the Gotti patriarch, proud of his empire, eventually could not resist bringing his namesake into the life. In 1990, John Gotti's world came crashing down. In December of that year, the FBI finally arrested him on a sweeping federal indictment armed with damning evidence, including secret recordings of Gotti discussing crimes, largely provided by his disillusioned underboss-turned-informant, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Grano. Gotti was charged with multiple murders, including ordering Castellano's hit, racketeering, and a laundry list of other crimes. This time there would be no beating the rap. As 1991 turned into 1992, John was stuck in a jail cell awaiting trial. And Grano's betrayal was splashed across the news. Victoria, despite having endured 2 prior imprisonments of her husband, found this one qualitatively different. Her husband wasn't just away. He was likely gone for good. The evidence was overwhelming, and with Gravano testifying, conviction was all but certain. She steeled herself for the outcome, but even she couldn't have predicted the next blow about to befall her. In January 1992, while John was still awaiting trial, FBI agents showed up at the Gotti home, not for John Sr., but for John Gotti Jr. At 27, John Jr. had quietly become acting boss of the Gambino family during his father's legal troubles, attempting to keep the business running. Victoria was blindsided by the revelation. She answered the door that day to find agents with an arrest warrant for her son on racketeering charges. It said that in that moment, something in her broke. All the years she had tolerated her husband's choices came crashing into one piercing realization. John had allowed their son to be pulled into the same deadly quagmire. When she managed to see her husband in prison not long after, Victoria was for perhaps the first time in their marriage truly furious with him. It was Victoria who intervened decisively. She went to visit her husband in prison, a special trip with a singular purpose. In the stark visiting room, separated by thick plexiglass, she issued John an ultimatum that he never expected. According to their daughter, Victoria told her husband in no uncertain terms, either you release him from his obligations to the mob, or I'll never speak to you again. I won't be here anymore. You'll never see me in your life again. This was no idle threat. After 35 years of marriage, Victoria was prepared to walk away to exile him from her life if he refused to let their son escape the mafia's clutches. John Gotti, who had stared down prosecutors, rivals, and traitors, now stared at his wife through that prison partition. He knew by the steely resolve in her voice that she meant every word. And John also knew that if he lost Victoria's presence and support, whatever remained of his life in prison would be intolerable. He yielded. With a curt nod, He gave his blessing for John Jr. to take the plea deal and quit the life, effectively ending the Gotti mob dynasty that he had once hoped to found. True to her word, Victoria continued to stand by John's side, figuratively at least, in his final years. An outcome that likely would not have happened had he defied her on this critical matter. It was perhaps the only time anyone ever successfully bossed the boss of the Gambino family. John Jr. did take a plea in 1999, serving several years in prison and later maintaining that he left the mafia for good. Victoria, despite the sorrow of seeing her son behind bars, could at least breathe easier, knowing that when he got out, he'd be free of that life that in many ways, this episode encapsulated who Victoria DiGiorgio was. A devoted wife who loved her husband deeply, but who loved her children even more, and who when pushed to the brink, demonstrated a will strong enough to humble a Don. The late 1990s ushered in the final chapter of John and Victoria's life together, one marked by physical decline and emotional reckoning. In 1998, from his prison cell, John Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer. Years of heavy smoking and the stress of prison life had taken their toll. The tumor in his neck was aggressive. He underwent surgery at a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri. And for a time, the cancer went into remission after part of his jaw and throat were removed. Victoria, upon hearing of his diagnosis, was terrified, not only of losing her husband, but that the prison authorities would let him suffer without proper care. By this time, John was inmate number 18-261-053. No longer the fearsome figure who once commanded a crime family, he was shackled to a hospital bed, gaunt from illness and treatment. Victoria, though intensely private, broke her silence to decry how John was being treated. "What they are doing to John is just extremely cruel," she told the New York Post in 1999. "He had cancer for months before they even wanted to treat him." Her words reflected a mixture of anger and helplessness. Despite everything, despite knowing all the pain John's choices had indirectly brought to her life, her instinct was to protect him, to advocate for him. She wrote letters to the Bureau of Prisons, beseeched attorneys to ensure he got proper medical attention, and made the arduous trip to Missouri whenever she could to sit at his bedside. The operations left John disfigured and weak. Speaking and eating were difficult for a man whose identity was built on power and pride. It was a humbling deterioration. In one visit, seeing John so frail, Victoria tried to buoy his spirits. She recalled all they had been through since those days in the Brooklyn bar, and she reminded him that they had once dreamed of growing old together, sitting on a porch and watching their grandchildren play. "I have spent 39 years of my life with him, and God willing I will spend the next 39 years of my life with him," she said hopefully around that. But it was not to be. The cancer returned with a vengeance by 2000, spreading to Gotti's head and neck. Treatment options were exhausted. John Gotti's final months were spent in the maximum security wing of the prison hospital, heavily sedated and in constant pain. His condition was terminal. Victoria continued to visit, though seeing the once vibrant man reduced to a whisper of himself was a cruel agony. In June 2002, as John's condition rapidly worsened, doctors knew the end was near. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died in the prison hospital at age 61. Victoria received the call at home that her husband was gone. Even having braced for it, she was devastated. It was the second time death had taken a piece of her. First, her son, now the partner, who had been at her side for 4 decades. Authorities, wary even in death of the mobster's notoriety, did not allow a simple homecoming. Gotti's body was flown under heavy guard back to New York for burial. The Gotti children arranged an extravagant funeral in Queens, befitting a man who, in their eyes, was larger than life. Hundreds of people lined the streets to pay respects. Some were neighbors and ordinary well-wishes, others unmistakably underworld figures in dark glasses who came to salute the fallen Don. On the day of the funeral, Victoria appeared at the Paper Vero funeral home to say her final goodbye, shrouded in black and shielded by her sons on either side. Reporters captured images of her stepping out of the wake, her face a mask of composure. Yet her eyes red from tears. In a way, those photographs mirrored ones taken 22 years earlier when she'd emerged from Frank's funeral. Once again, a grieving mother and wife in black. John was laid to rest in a bronze casket, carried through the streets on a horse-drawn carriage, followed by a line of 19 black limousines. Floral displays shaped like cigars and the Yankees logo, two of his favorite things, accompanied the procession. Victoria walked behind the coffin with her children, holding a rosary tightly in her hand. If there was any comfort for her that day, it was that unlike her son's burial, this time she wasn't standing alone. Her family was beside her. And she carried the quiet relief of knowing that in John's final years, he had made peace with her over the one topic that had truly divided them, their son's future. Before John lost the ability to speak, he had told her that he, too, didn't want John Jr. to spend the rest of his life behind bars. It wasn't much, but it was something she held on to. After the rush and noise of the funeral passed, life settled into a softer, lonelier grief for Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti. Widowed at 59, she withdrew almost entirely from public life. Unlike many mob wives who wrote memoirs or gave interviews, Victoria chose silence. No television appearances, no book deals, no dramatic tell-alls. Having witnessed firsthand how publicity shattered her family, she wanted nothing more than privacy. Her days continued much as they always had, dedicated to her family. By then, she was a grandmother several times over. She doted on her grandchildren and remained a steady, grounding presence for her surviving children. They had all endured more than most families ever would. Angel and Victoria Jr. had lost a brother and watched their father go to prison. John Jr. spent years behind bars and faced multiple trials throughout the 2000s. He would be indicted again and again, though never convicted in those later attempts. And young Peter grew up under the long, heavy shadow of his father's reputation. Through it all, Victoria was the anchor. Her home in Howard Beach became the site of Sunday dinners once again, with one empty chair where Charlie, her nickname for John, used to sit. Financially, John's death left uncertainty. The government had seized many of his assets, and being the wife of a mafia boss didn't come with retirement benefits. Still, it's believed Victoria inherited around $2 million through John's hidden investments and the sale of certain properties. It was enough to live comfortably, though certainly not lavishly. She never again struggled the way she had in the 1960s, but she didn't chase extravagance either. She didn't need it. A modest life surrounded by family was all she had ever truly wanted. In 2006, she made one of her last public remarks. Speaking to the New York Daily News on the anniversary of John's death, Victoria summed up her life as the rare mob wife who had remained loyal until the end. Today, Victoria still lives far from the spotlight. Now in her late 80s, she has watched as the Gotti name continues to fascinate the world, through films, documentaries, and even a reality show, Growing Up Gotti, starring her daughter Victoria in the early 2000s. She chose not to participate in any of it, allowing her children to tell their own versions if they wished. Victoria has guarded her memories quietly, in her own way. Her unwavering loyalty and inner strength made her a legend among mob families, the wife who never broke, never betrayed. As one writer noted, while other mob wives turned informant or walked away, Victoria stood firm beside a man known for his notoriety. Her devotion did not mean blindness. She loved John Gotti, but she did not worship him. She needed him, but when it mattered most, she stood up to him. If John was the Teflon Don to the world, then Victoria may well have been the steel backbone of the Gotti family, unyielding when it counted. And though Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti will always be overshadowed publicly by her husband's infamous legacy, those who know her story understand that behind the legend of the Dapper Don stood a woman of remarkable resilience. Her life remains the untold chapter of the Gotti saga, a story of unwavering love and quiet courage that ultimately outlasted even the Don himself.